My name is Mark Cantor. As president of the Jewish Heritage Center of Western Canada, I'd like to welcome you to the second in a series of our Saul and Forrest TV virtual lectures. Today's topic is a conversation about human rights in the world today with Irwin Cotler and Bob Ray. Just a few words about our organization. The Jewish Heritage Center of Western Canada is the umbrella organization for the Marion and Ed Vicker Jewish Museum, the Freeman Family Foundation Holocaust Education Center, the Genealogical Institute, and the Jewish Historical Society Archives. Our archives is the principal repository of the history of the local Jewish community, as well as settlements in northwestern Ontario, Saskatchewan, Alberta, and British Columbia. It is a major destination for academics and the general public, and its resources have been used for publications, lectures, school projects, exhibits, conferences, and workshops. In a nutshell, the Jewish Heritage Center preserves and promotes our Jewish history, and our vision is to forge a pathway to the future by educating the present and future generations. I would need the rest of the afternoon to tell you about all the wonderful programs, events, and exhibits that we put on. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that the Jewish Heritage Center of Western Canada is located on ancestral lands on Treaty 1 territory. The Red River Valley is also the birthplace of the Métis. We acknowledge the water in the museum is sourced from the Shoal Lake 40 First Nation. Now, I would like to introduce our moderator. The Honorable Anita Neville is a longtime board member of the Jewish Heritage Center and has been active in many community organizations. She is a former member of Parliament. Anita?
Thank you, Mark. I'm delighted to be here this afternoon and even more delighted to have the opportunity to introduce our two distinguished guests. We have with us the Honorable Irwin Cotler, who is the founder and chair of the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights, Canada's Special Envoy on Preserving Holocaust Remembrance and Combating Antisemitism, a member of the high-level panel of legal experts on media freedom, the Emeritus Professor of Law at McGill University, an international human rights lawyer and counsel to prisoners of conscience. He is a former Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada and a longtime member of Parliament. Through his advocacy work, both in Canada and internationally, he has profoundly made a difference in the lives of many. We also are very privileged and delighted to have with us the Honorable Bob Ray. Bob Ray is the Ambassador and Permanent Representative of Canada to the United Nations in New York. Mr. Ray served as Premier of Ontario from 1990 to 1995, and interim leader of the Liberal Party of Canada from 2011 to 2013. He was elected to federal and provincial parliaments 11 times between 1978 and 2013. I can only think of all of those elections that he went through. Mr. Ray is a senior fellow at Massey College and the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights. He served as the chief negotiator for the First Nations that are members of the Mattawa Tribal Council in Northern Ontario between 2013 and 2018. In October 2017, Mr. Ray was appointed as Canada's Special Envoy to Myanmar. In this role, he engaged in diplomatic efforts to address the crisis in the country's Rakhine state and wrote the report, quote, "Tell Them We're Human," which came out in 2018. In March 2020, he was named by Prime Minister Trudeau to be Canada's Special Envoy on humanitarian and refugee issues. This led to another report, "A Global Pandemic Requires a Global Response," which was made public shortly after his appointment to the UN. Mr. Ray is a Privy Councillor, a Companion of the Order of Canada, a member of the Order of Ontario, and his numerous awards and honorary degrees from institutions from Canada and around the world. It is my very great pleasure to have with us today two former colleagues, and I'm going to ask Professor Cotler if he would begin the discussion. No sound.
Thank you, Anita, and it's a pleasure to be part of yet another exemplary forum organized by the Jewish Heritage Center under the exemplary leadership of Mark and Bell, and it's a pleasure to be with you moderating. We served together as colleagues in Parliament, but more as friends. And in fact, you exemplify what I call the Winnipeg connection for me, which goes back years and which has had an important impact in my life. And I'll mention just two of many that I can. Chief Justice Samuel Friedman, who was a model for me of a jurist from Winnipeg and Manitoba, and Professor Maxwell Cohn, who went on to be a law professor, taught me at McGill, was dean at McGill Law School, just two of the many who made an enormous contribution, not simply to Canadian jury, but to the Canadian people and to Manitoba and Canada as a whole. So it's a pleasure to be with you, and I could not have had a better partner on the panel than Bob Ray. As I said in informal conversation before, I'm always comforted by the fact that if I appear with him, I know that it doesn't make a difference what I say, because you will all benefit from what he has to say. He was one of the most inspirational people ever to serve in the Canadian Parliament, a model parliamentarian, a model leader for our Liberal Party. My only regret was that we did not all have the experience of him being the Prime Minister of this country. We meet, as it happens, at an important, I would say, historical inflection moment of remembrance and reminder. We are meeting really on what I would call on the occasion of four different but interrelated pandemics. The first, of course, is COVID-19, which has not only differentially impacted on, and prejudicially so, in the most vulnerable of populations, but has had a global impact. And we know of the suffering and deaths. We've witnessed them, we've experienced them, and even now, and Bob has been really a leader in this, in terms of global solidarity to combat the pandemic, etc. But here too, there's been a differentiated response, and the vulnerable have not always been those that have been able to receive the necessary vaccinations and the like. So we have the COVID-19 pandemic. The second is what I would call the pandemic of systemic racism. And here we've been witness to systemic racism, which targeting our Indigenous peoples, Blacks and people of color, the murder of George Floyd becoming a message and metaphor for that. We've had the more recent outbreaks of systemic racism with regard to Asian Canadians, and not only in Canada. And just yesterday evening, I was part of a federal, provincial, territorial conference with respect to systemic racism. And of course, along with all this, we have the pandemic of anti-Semitism, the oldest, most enduring, most virulent, and most lethal of hatreds. Just 3 weeks ago, the annual B'nai B'rith audit showed once again, for the 5th straight year, that Jews were the most targeted group for hate crimes in Canada. A similar report came out with respect to the United States from the Anti-Defamation League. And we saw similar reports coming out from different parts of Europe, Germany, the UK, France, the Ukraine, all reporting highest levels of anti-Semitic violence. And if you want a kind of an example of the convergence of pandemics of COVID-19 and the pandemic of anti-Semitism, we only have to look at the manner in which we've been witnessing once again the resurrection of the classic anti-Semitic trope of the Jews as the poisoner of the wells, where Jews, the Jewish people, and Israel have been accused not only of manufacturing the virus, spreading the virus, but profiting from the virus. Just one looking glass into this pandemic of anti-Semitism. And then we come to what I would call the global political pandemic. And by the global political pandemic, I mean, and it's characterized by a resurgent global authoritarianism, the backsliding of democracies, assaults on human rights, including assaults on media freedom, the linchpin for democracy, and political prisoners as a looking glass into this resurgent global authoritarianism. Within this resurgent global authoritarianism, that which is mounted the most serious multi-pronged assault on what we like to call the rules-based international order has been Xi Jinping's China. And in each instance where I speak of one of the global authoritarians, I do it in that context because I want to distinguish it from the people and publics, whether I speak of Khamenei's Iran or Maduro's Venezuela, from the people and publics who are otherwise themselves the mass targets of that repression. But what we see in Xi Jinping's China today is perhaps the greatest assault within this framework of resurgent global authoritarianism on the rules-based international order, beginning with the targeting of what Xi Jinping has called the 5 poisons. And within that, the mass atrocities targeting the Uyghurs, which are effectively acts constitutive of genocide. The frontal assault on not only the democracy movement in Hong Kong, but of democracy itself in Hong Kong. The persecution and prosecution of the Falun Gong. We're now entering upon the 23rd year of the attempt to use the Chinese authorities' terms to eradicate this illegal criminal cult, which does nothing other but engage in spiritual meditation exercises, which have become criminalized along with them as well. And then we have the repression of Tibet and the menacing of Taiwan. So these are the 5 poisons, but it doesn't end there. It is not as well known as it deserves to be that China jails more journalists than any other country in the world, that is increasingly jailing the lawyers who would defend them, that it was the very suppression of information, the jailing of doctors and dissidents that led to the initial spread of the coronavirus, where the disinformation then blamed it on others. And we have, of course, the illegal harvesting of organs of vulnerable groups, be they the Falun Gong and the Uyghurs, which the China Human Rights Tribunal under Sir Geoffrey Nice characterized as being crimes against humanity. And I haven't even gone into the global disinformation campaigns, and where the National Intelligence Committee of Parliament itself identified China, along with Russia, as 2 threats to the sovereignty and security and human rights of Canadians. So that's on the resurgent global authoritarianism. But if we look at political prisoners in each instance, they are a looking glass. In China, we have for 15 years now, the Uyghur Canadian Hussein Chalil disappeared. And we have also Dr. Wang Bingzhang, one of the longest serving political prisoners in China, who suffered a series of debilitating strokes in prison, where he's now in his 20th year of imprisonment for nothing other than founding the Overseas China Democracy Movement after he graduated from medicine in McGill, got a PhD coming here from China. He then decided it would be good to be a doctor, but better to try to bring about democracy in China. On a visit to Vietnam in 2002, he was abducted, brought back to China, and arrested and imprisoned within a few hours, sentenced to lifetime imprisonment in solitary confinement on the dual trumped up charges of treason and terrorism. And where I said he suffered debilitating strokes. If we look at Iran, we have the iconic woman human rights lawyer, Nasrin Sotoudeh, who's the embodiment of the struggle for human rights in Iran, referred to as the Mandela of Iran, whose persecution and prosecution is itself reflective and representative of the criminalization of fundamental freedoms in Iran, indeed of the fundamental of the criminalization of innocence in Iran. Nasrin Sotoudeh has gone down the line for women, and the women's rights movement is perhaps the most important rights movement in Iran itself, down the line for juveniles destined for execution, down the line for journalists whose freedom of expression has been silenced, down the line for Baha'is persecuted and prosecuted in the most targeted religious minority in Iran, down the line for other lawyers who sought to represent political prisoners, and down the line for other political prisoners, until she herself became a political prisoner close to 3 years ago, sentenced to 38 years in prison and 148 lashes, a virtual death sentence for a woman in her late 50s. And what brings all this culture of impunity into this, another pandemic of impunity, is that 2 days after that horrific sentence, Iran was elected to the UN Commission on Women's Rights. And if we look at Venezuela, we have Judge Maria Lourdes Afiuni. Some 11 years ago, she acquitted a political prisoner. Thereafter, because of that, she herself was arrested, imprisoned, tortured, in detention. And then the Maduro regime used what they call the Afiuni effect to intimidate and threaten other judges that if they were to act in the same way, they would end up the same way. I was a member of an OAS panel of what we were called of independent legal experts that determined in our report in May 2018 that the Maduro regime was engaged in 7 major crimes against humanity. Some 4 months after that, in September 2018, the Canadian government, led by then Foreign Minister Chrystia Freeland, organized 7 countries to make the first ever collective referral of a state party to the International Criminal Court, Venezuela, by 7 states making that collective referral. Yet regrettably, to this day, the special prosecutor has not yet opened an investigation, something not only lamented in the recent report by the special prosecutor for the Organization of American States, Jared Ganzer, who not only in fact enlarged upon our findings of fact and conclusions of law regarding the 7 major crimes against humanity, but condemned the special prosecutor for what he called her impunity in that regard, and her incentivizing of further crimes in Venezuela. Very briefly, on the last 2 authoritarians that I mentioned, in Russia, political prisoners, not as well known as it deserves to be, have increased 10-fold in the last 5 years alone, of which Alexei Navalny is here too, a case and cause. And finally, with regard to Saudi Arabia, as we meet, Raif Badawi is enduring his 9th year of imprisonment for saying 9 years ago what the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman has himself been saying for the last 4 years, of the need for a more open Saudi Arabia, a more moderate Islam. And his sister, Samar Badawi, was imprisoned for calling for the right to drive, even though Mohammed bin Salman then went ahead to bring about the reform to give women the right to drive, but then imprisoned the women who had called for the right to drive, while his lawyer, Walid Abu Khair, was sentenced to 15 years in prison. And that's just a looking glass with regard to Saudi Arabia. And I haven't even spoken about the women who themselves have been at the vanguard of the human rights movement and have been imprisoned. So this brings me to the last point that I want to mention, that we are, and I used political prisoners as a looking glass, experiencing a pandemic of impunity. Not only is there no accountability for the violators and justice for the victims, but in fact, as I mentioned, with Iran being elected to the UN Commission on Human Rights, the violators are in fact rewarded along with that impunity. And as I'm speaking to you from Jerusalem, where we are witnessing yet again a massive assault on human rights. In the last 3 days alone, over 1,500 rockets and missiles have been launched by Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, a widespread and systematic attack targeting Israeli civilians, cities, and towns as an instrument of state policy. Simply put, that is defined in international law as a war crime and a crime against humanity. But it doesn't end there. The firing of these missiles and rockets are taking place from residential centers. Not only is that a war crime, but it's holding Palestinians hostage as they become human shields for the firing of these rockets, which leads yet to even a third sense of impunity in this regard, where the Palestinian Authority, and it's not as well known as it deserves to be, actually incentivizes terrorism. $350 million of their annual budget that is given to support and finance those who commit terrorist acts. And the more brutal the terrorist act, and the longer that the terrorist serves in prison, the more he, in fact, is the beneficiary of being financed in what has been called a pay-for-slay campaign, a really cruel culture of impunity. And we see this taking place right now in the terrorist acts. And finally, and with this I'll close, is the state-orchestrated incitement to hatred, to violence, to terror, even to genocide by Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad. And let us always remember one of the more important lessons that emerged from the Holocaust and genocides and mass atrocities since, as the Supreme Court of Canada put it, that, to quote their words, that the Holocaust did not begin in the gas chambers, said the Supreme Court. It began with words. These are the catastrophic effects of racism. These are the chilling facts of history. And regrettably, we are revisiting that now in these massive war crimes and crimes against humanity being targeting Israeli civilian populations. And let me say that this is not did not happen by happenstance. What happened here was brought about because the Israeli-Palestinian issue was no longer part of the main agenda. The Hamas was lamenting that fact. I lamented the fact that the peace process has not been able to go forward. But what happened was that with the Abrahamic Accords, with the normalization of relations, Hamas felt the need that it had to bring the Palestinian issue back to the mainstream. And so not only were the massive rockets fired in that regard, but in fact, it's the stirring up of hatred around Jerusalem, within cities where Israelis and Arabs have been living in coexistence. I'm referring to, and in the last 3 days alone, one of the most disturbing and terrifying things has been the violence here. Just before I got onto this webinar, a third synagogue was torched in Lod. We've been seeing the torching of synagogues, schools, and the like in areas where there's been model Jewish-Arab coexistence. I'm talking not only with regard to Lod, Ramleh, but Haifa, Akko, and the like. We have had horrific cases of violence, incitement to violence. We've also seen, extremist mobs of Jews who come in order to protect other Jews, but have only aggravated the situation. And we have to realize the dangers of state and sundry incitement to violence, which is really fanning the flames and underpinning the rocket fire from Hamas and the like. So I think I'll close here. What I'm saying is that we have intersecting pandemics, each on its own constitutes an assault on human rights. And we have a responsibility wherever we can to best address and redress these violations, to bring justice for the victims, accountability for the violators. And all I can say before Bob Ray speaks is that I could not imagine a better person that could represent our country at the United Nations and be engaged there and internationally in the promotion and protection of human rights on behalf of Canada and the international community as a whole.
Well, thank you, Irwin. I really appreciated it. The reason that I suggested you should go first is because I think you speak with such an immediacy on the issues that I know our listeners will want to hear about. I want to express my thanks to the Jewish Heritage Center and to the audience for coming today. Great to see Anita Neville and to be associated once again with my friends in the Jewish community in Winnipeg. I've had many other occasions to mention my great grandparents who initially homesteaded in the metropolis of Cupar, Saskatchewan. And then as things went awry after the First World War on the prairies, came to Winnipeg and made Winnipeg their home. So it's a great pleasure and privilege for me to be able to be back with you and have a chance to chat directly with you. It's pretty hard to follow Irwin. I wanted to just make a couple of points really, and then I think it would be great if we could get into some questions or a bit of a conversation. The first thing is to perhaps to give you an account of my day yesterday. There were two events that, well, three really, that I want to talk about. The first is a group of human rights organizations and about 18 countries co-sponsored a moment where we heard from leading representatives of the Uyghur community, a couple of human rights leaders, and many representatives of different countries, including Canada, talking about the Uyghur situation. But you need to know as well, the surrounding event. First of all, the organization of this was very hush-hush over a period of months, because we knew that as soon as it became known that we were doing this, that the Chinese government would put tremendous pressure on all of us, as well as on all the other governments, not to participate, not to engage, not to be involved. And for those of us who've been involved for the last while on the issues of human rights, Hong Kong, the Uyghurs, of course, the detention of the two Michaels, we're used to this. We're used to a very, very far-reaching, quite sophisticated, very determined effort by the Chinese government to just shut it down. So it's not only about the repression, which Irwin has described so effectively, but it's also how a country like China can try to use its influence, its power, its platforms, which the United Nations is certainly one, in order to frankly just spread disinformation, just say, well, that isn't true, this is true, or there's something else is true. And you sort of say, no, this is true. This is what is happening. This is what the evidence shows. This is what the aerial photography shows. This is what the human accounts show. This is what we know. And as we saw earlier this week, the statistics on what's happened to childbearing and what's happened to population growth, we know these things are happening. There's no other explanation for why they're happening, the extent to which they're happening. But I think it was for me a very useful reminder to know and to let Canadians know that when we intervene as we have intervened, and when we make clear our position as we've made clear our position, it's faced with great resistance. And we've got a lot of work to do to understand that the democratic governments, the governments that believe in human rights, the governments that are working as best we can to advance these agendas are not working in an open field where we can just say, okay, here's where we go. And we can look partly to the past, to the achievements that we made, for example, the establishment of the International Criminal Court, the steps that we've taken, the Genocide Convention, the Genocide Against Torture, the various legal initiatives we've been able to carry out in order to achieve greater accountability. These have all come slowly, gradually, painfully, but they've been resisted, and really dramatically resisted. And in particular, I want to just underline what Irwin said about the growth of authoritarian governments. There's their use of disinformation, cybercrime, their ability to engage in not only in internal surveillance, but also to spread their surveillance around the world, their ability to disrupt communication. These are very sophisticated campaigns, often underestimated by all of us, but they're very real. And they have everything to do with not only with human rights, but also with human security. And it's part of the battle that we're fighting. In the afternoon, I went to a session of the Security Council, which we're not on, as you all know, but it was what's called an aria session, which has nothing to do with opera. It's named for somebody named Aria, and it's a session where the Security Council opens up and has an open session where other countries are allowed to comment, other countries are allowed to speak. And we went there to hear an account by the person who has been the prosecutor in Iraq with the tribunal called UNITAD, which was set up by the UN to gather evidence with respect to crimes against humanity in Iraq. And he had just released a report saying that on the basis of his 3-year investigation, he determined that there was evidence to support a finding of genocide against the Yazidis, who are a minority Christian group living in Iraq who were singled out by Daesh for the most cruel and brutal punishment. Mass graves, mass killing, mass torture, recruitment of women as sex slaves, unbelievable conduct, but believable because we've got the evidence and we were shown the evidence, we were shown the basis upon which this kind of a charge needed to proceed. And the most eloquent person who was there was not any delegate, not any ambassador, but a Yazidi woman by the name of Nadia Murad, who gave the most extraordinary account of her life. She lost 5 sisters, a brother, and her parents in the massacre. She herself was recruited into a forced marriage with one of the Daesh leaders, and she'd managed to escape. And the reason I recite this is because it's so important to understand that as much as we criticize the United Nations for its failures, which are many, it's important to understand that this is what I would call a forum, a platform, a place where we can in fact engage successfully in revealing these abuses and also figuring out, okay, now we know where do we go now with this evidence? How do we take it forward? And it's not that you necessarily immediately stop bad things from happening, because we don't, but that it's a place where these issues have to be fought out. And I guess this is the final point that I really want to make, and I think Irwin, in his own way, has made it as thoroughly as it can be, and that is to say that this is a critical moment for Canada, I believe, where we really have to recognize that terrible things are happening in the world. Sometimes it's not entirely clear what they are because there are so many competing accounts about what's taking place, so many attempts to label and brand the event as something that it isn't, or attempts to avoid looking at, well, what's the underlying reasons why we have the conflicts that we're in. And I think that the reason I emphasize this is because for me, one of the great impacts that COVID has had and the pandemic has had is that it's tended to increase our isolation from one another. Obviously, I'm speaking to you staring into a camera in a little room all by myself. And I'm somewhat isolated from the reality of meeting all of you, knowing that all of you are not in a room somewhere. You're also listening to me on this screen. And we've been doing this now for about 1.5 years. And as we do this, I believe we become more isolated. The second thing we do is we say, I want to get my government to help me in the difficulty that I'm in, which is what we've seen. We've seen citizens insisting on a higher level of performance, on the government responding to our needs, my needs, in order to protect me, my family, my children from the impact of the virus, but also from the social and economic impact of the pandemic. And in so doing, actually, our governments have actually responded remarkably well. And mind you, it's with borrowed money, and a lot of borrowed money, but they made the decision, we're going to go out and put ourselves in a financial position we haven't been in since the Second World War, and we're going to do it in order to keep people whole as much as we can. But one of the things we need to recognize is that most of the people live in countries where that's not possible. First of all, because if they live in authoritarian countries, their government doesn't give a damn. Their government doesn't care. Why do you think the Chinese and the Russians can practice something called vaccine diplomacy? Because they're not vaccinating their own people. They say it's better for us to, more effective for us to, and they'll say it's all about international solidarity. They're trying to win that part of the propaganda war. They say, look how selfish the Western governments are. Look how generous we are. Well, the Western governments are, I would argue, not necessarily being selfish. What they're doing is saying, well, these are my citizens. I have to take care of my citizens. But my point is, we can't just take care of ourselves. We have to take care of others. And I think the global system is challenged today because of this, the challenge to empathy and to solidarity, which affects a lot of other things as well. People say, well, why should I worry about what's happening in some other country? Why should I care about this or that? It doesn't directly affect me. Now, I think we can prove and convince people that actually what happens in a pandemic does affect you, because we see this virus growing now back for a third or fourth time in some other country, India, the devastating impact in India. And then we have to come to grips with the fact that, well, what happens if that virus, as it moves through the region, the impact it has on other countries, and ultimately the impact that it can have on the rest of the world. We're getting evidence today that the virus, signs of it now in East Africa in quite a significant way, because of course there's a movement of people, there's a movement of a population, nothing stays locked up in one country. And that's what happens with a virus, it gets around. So when I say we got to vaccinate everybody because that's the only way we're really going to be safe, I think a lot of people understand that. But there's something we also have to do, and that is respond to the social, the political, the legal, the other situations that are happening in all their complexity in the rest of the world, so we can in fact protect ourselves from another kind of virus, the virus of hatred, the virus of division, the epidemic of oppression and authoritarianism. And we're not so far removed from that in North America. We're not. We might have thought we were, but we're not. And to some extent, we can see it in our own midst. We can see signs where we're not paying enough attention to the racial and human rights challenges and difficulties in our own country. We have to recognize that the virus is actually not a great equalizer. It's a great magnifier. It's a great revealer. It's magnified and revealed many things about our own society. our own politics, our own commitment to human rights, as it has around the world. And that's where I think we have to be aware of the very special and particular moment that we're in. Finally, I want to just say a word about the third discussion that I had yesterday, which was not to anyone's surprise, it was a discussion about what's happening in the Middle East, what's happening in Israel, Palestine at the moment. And I had a conversation with a delegate, I won't say where he was from. And what struck me in listening to his account of what he thought was happening was there was a kind of, in his own mind, a kind of demonization to say, why is this happening? And I said, well, it's happening because the conflict in the Middle East between Israelis and Palestinians has never really been resolved. And the origins of it have never really been sufficiently understood and appreciated. And when I say things like, I said to him, when I say things like Israel is there as a matter of right, and the Palestinians are there as a matter of right. So between them, there's no challenge of saying, do you have any right to be there? That should not be. And he said, well, yeah, he said, but the Palestinians were there first. I said, actually, I think if you want to talk about first, the Canaanites and the Moabites and the Jewish people were there, long before we talk about all the others who were there. He said, yeah, that's ancient history. I said, well, but you need to understand that the fact that you would say that one group is there as a matter of right and another group is not, is the problem. That's from my perspective, that's where the problem sets in. And as long as we have that attitude, which is very widespread in the United Nations, among many, not in the UN, but among many nations, among many countries, you have to say that this is always going to end up with one party simply blaming someone else and saying, that's the problem. And I think we have to really understand how deep-seated the history of anti-Semitism is, and how deep-seated its mindset is, and how its manifestations come forward all the time. I think the best description that I had of this was from a scholar that I heard once say in talking about anti-Semitism, to say, in many people's minds, in sort of the modern culture, anti-Semitism is seen as an eruption, a catastrophe that happened in Germany between 1920 and 1945, and it exploded in the concentration camps, and it's done. He said there are so many problems with that theory that you can't even begin, but we need to understand that it goes way back in time before then, and it has erupted many, many different times in different countries in different ways. And in fact, it's a chronic disease that has never been eradicated and then continues to erupt from time to time to time. And that, I think, is how we have to understand it. This is a long battle. But I think I'm encouraged by the fact that not only is this a long battle, but the battle for human rights is also a long battle. But the point about these battles is you have to be prepared to fight them. One of the worst phrases I've heard recently is for people to talk to me about, oh, we got to get out of Afghanistan because it's a forever war. And I said, well, the war against terrorism is kind of an extremism and anti-Semitism and, the subjugation of women. That is kind of it's a forever battle, whether it's a war or not. Whether it's the most effective way to solve it is to send in the Marines, that's another debate. But the notion somehow that these are conflicts that will disappear if we just stop fighting them, that's preposterous. If we stop fighting them, well, then we know we'll lose the battle. And the battle will be won by others who have no interest in human rights, no interest in pluralism, no interest in equality between women and men, no interest in protecting the religious and the human rights of every single person in the world. And so, yes, it's, if you like, it's a forever war. And we just have to remember that we have no choice but to keep fighting it.
Anita, you're on mute, Anita.
Better? It is a bleak picture that both of you are painting of the world before us and for our children. There's a number of questions here, and I'm going to ask some, and I have a number of my own that I'd like to put forward. I don't know what our time is, but let me put forward one that from Melanie Richters, who says, as individuals, it's easy to feel helpless about the situation with the Uyghurs. What can individuals do to support the Uyghurs in a way that actually matters?
Well, if I could just briefly say, I think the first thing is, I don't mean this to sound trite. I mean, the first thing is to say, the first thing we have to do is live our lives in such a way that we are genuinely respecting every human being we meet, and that we are genuinely appreciative of their reality and of their situation, whoever we meet, whenever we meet them. That is a very important expression of solidarity. And I think it's important for all of us to recognize that closer to our own homes, there are lots of issues and lots of ways in which we need to better express that solidarity with one another and our appreciation for the human struggle that so many communities and people are going through in our own neighborhoods that perhaps we don't even think about. With respect to the Uyghurs, I think we need to understand that there is such a huge disinformation campaign underway that it's really important that we do our homework as individuals. The Raoul Wallenberg Center has just completed an excellent study, which I can promote, because Irwin might be accused of too much self-interest in describing the Uyghur genocide and going through the details. The first thing we can do is learn the facts, learn the situation, do the research, hear the arguments on the other side, make up our own minds as to what we think needs to be done, and then ask our government what steps they're taking. Government of Canada is doing some stuff. The government of Canada is taking steps. But to provide support for those governments and those parties that are actually pushing forward. And then finally, I do think that Xinjiang province is the cotton capital of the world. Think about what you're wearing, where your clothes come from, and think about what steps we might take, what companies are doing business there, what steps we might take to begin to expose some of that activity.
Thank you. I'm going to ask a question that came from Harold Schuster, and he directs it to Professor Cotler, who he says, are you willing to admit that Israel is also committing human rights violations against the Palestinian people? The holding of children in military detention, the passing of state laws that discriminate against Arab members of the state of Israel, withholding medical aid to citizens, which I'm not sure is so, and the list of Israeli human rights against the Palestinians is longer than that of China. How would you respond to that, Professor Cotler?
Well, I'd say number one, Israel, like any other state, is responsible for any violations of human rights and humanitarian law. And the Jewish people in the state of Israel are not entitled to any particular privilege or protection because of the horrors of Jewish history and the Holocaust. But that's my point, that no one should seek, nor should Israel seek, to be above the law. The problem is that Israel is being systematically denied equality before the law in the international arena. Not that Israel should respect human rights, she must, but that the rights of Israel deserve equal respect. Not that human rights standards should not be applied to Israel, they must be, but they must be applied equally to everyone else. And I think when you have a situation where, if I can put it this way, the laundering of the delegitimization of Israel finds expression, regrettably, under the protective cover of the United Nations, of which I am a great and will continue to be a strong supporter. But where you have annual, some 20 General Assembly resolutions singling out one member state of the international community, which happens to be Israel, and some 5 resolutions against the rest of the international community combined, that's not only singling out one state for selective opprobrium and indictment. What that does, it gives the major human rights violators exculpatory immunity. Second example, which I would take, and I don't want to go through them, is that the contracting parties to the Geneva Convention have met 3 times in their history to put one state in the docket of the accused for violations of international human rights and humanitarian law. It has not been China or Russia or Syria, and I can go on. On all 3 occasions, the only state ever put in that docket was Israel. And I think that's part of the problem, is because if Israel is held out as the target of selective opprobrium and indictment, then regrettably, it will give Hamas and others a free pass. They will believe that they can continue to conduct their aggression with impunity. So yes, Israel must be held accountable, even though it is a democratic state and Hamas is a terrorist state. It must be held accountable for any violations. But at the same time, we cannot allow situations which incentivize terror by allowing state funds, now this is not Hamas, the Palestinian Authority, to in fact finance and reward acts of terror, and where the Canadian government is part of that contributing body. So I think what we need at this point, I'll go back to what Bob says, both are right. Both are entitled to self-determination, both the Jewish people and the Palestinian people. Both are entitled to live in independent, secure, democratic, rule of law, rights protecting states. But that's the point. We have to hold both account to those same standards.
Thank you. I have a question now from Professor Alan Mills, who asked whether Professor Cotler and Ambassador Ray would speak to the issue of Canada's policy towards the ICC, Israel, and the territory.
Well, I could sort of say I'm in a bit of a challenge, saying very much on this. I'm now a vice president of the Assembly of States Parties of the ICC. What I would say about it is this: Canada, the Canadian government, expressed its not just its concern, but its view, its legal view, that it was not appropriate for a prosecution to proceed or an investigation to proceed, partly on jurisdictional grounds, but partly over the issue of what we call complementarity. That is to say, where a country like Israel has a sophisticated judicial system, what that has to be taken into account when one considers that whether or not to proceed with an investigation. Having said that, at the same time, I am not one of those people who thinks it's appropriate for any of us to comment on either prosecutorial discretion or judicial discretion. I'm not going to interfere with a decision by the prosecutor. I don't think that's appropriate. In my role, certainly in my role as representative of the government of Canada, but also in my role as the vice president of the Assembly of States Parties, I don't think it's appropriate for me to comment on that.
Thank you.
Anita, I have less restraint maybe than.
Go ahead.
You've always had less restraint than that.
Although I share Bob's principled position, let me just say that I've been a long time and remain a supporter of the ICC. I co-sponsored the first legislation as a parliamentarian to domesticate the Rome Statute, the War Crimes and Crimes Against Humanity Act, which we enacted in Parliament in the year 2000, and chaired the first assembly of state parliamentarians for the International Criminal Court. And fast forward, why I gave the example of Venezuela is because regrettably, and that's why I will make a comment here with the special prosecutor, regrettably, the special prosecutor did not open yet an investigation re Venezuela, even though Venezuela is a state party to the ICC, and even though a collective referral, the only collective referral ever, was made by a even though the first ever collective referral was made with regard to Venezuela to the ICC, but the special prosecutor did open an investigation, even though one, Israel is not a state party to the ICC, and the Palestinian Authority is not yet a state, much as I might wish her to be a state. And the Palestinians themselves acknowledged that they have aspirations but are not yet a state. So as somebody who cares about the impartiality, the independence, the integrity of the court, I'm worried about what has the appearance of differential standards being exercised in that regard.
Thank you. I have a question that someone forwarded to me about Canada. And the question says, a decision by the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal about 5 years ago held that there have been and continue to be systemic discrimination in the provision of child welfare services to First Nations children. The tribunal directed that the discrimination should stop and there should be financial compensation paid. As we all know, there have been numerous legal challenges since then, and the First Nation children have not yet received the financial compensation which was ordered. In your view, can we draw any conclusions from these decisions about the state of human rights in Canada? And do you believe the Canadian human rights legislation and the Charter are able to effectively address the issues of inequality in Canadian society today?
I would say, first of all, that I think the principles that were set out in the decision of the Human Rights Tribunal are correct. I think that the fact of the matter, the argument of the government of Canada before the tribunal through the last 10 years prior to the decision, which was in 2014 or 15, was this. It said, look, the Crown will decide on its own what it thinks is an adequate payment to Indigenous communities for the services that they're providing. It's in our sole discretion to make that decision. And we are sovereign in this regard, and we have the absolute right to make that decision. It's not up to a court to tell the Crown how to spend its money. Put simply, that's the position the government took. And the Human Rights Tribunal said, well, actually, no. Actually, we can apply standards of fairness and discrimination and basic equality in assessing the level of services that is being provided in comparison to what other kinds of services are being provided in similar or geographically close or whatever communities. We make those comparisons all the time, and assuming whether something is done is fair or is constitutional. I support that decision 100%. And in fact, I think the implications of that decision not only go speak to child welfare and to, they speak to everything. They speak to every level of human service that's provided to reserve communities. And needless to say, the cost of that will be very, very substantial because it will lead to a significant assessment of whether in housing or in healthcare or in seniors care or in childcare, whatever it may be, whether there's a level of equality in the services that are being provided. I think the economic consequences of this are going to be huge. And I think they will be enormously beneficial to the Indigenous communities when they are finally implemented by the government of Canada. But one of the challenges in any legal system is the courts don't spend the money. The courts simply say, here are the principles you have to apply in how you spend the money. And this is not a great feature of our system, but it is the reality of our system. And so it's something that I think we have to say, and governments have to recognize, in my opinion, Canadian governments have an obligation to do much more, whether it's federal or provincial, than they might think they would like to or feel obliged to do, because the level of inequality is so great in the level at which services are being provided. And I think this is something which is a national disgrace, and I think it's something we have to continue to face up to. And I don't think I'm saying anything that is untoward toward my employer, the government of Canada. I think it's just a reality that the implications of that decision have not been fully implemented by the government of Canada. That's something that still has to happen.
Anita, I just want to say, I concur with everything that Bob said. The only thing I want to commend him for the work that he has done in the trenches for Indigenous rights. The only comment I would add is when I was Minister of Justice and Attorney General, I recall that we were engaged in litigation with respect to the Indigenous peoples on a variety of areas. And I remember going to our then Prime Minister, Paul Martin, you remember, Anita, and I said to him, look, Paul, we can litigate some of these things till the end of time. Nobody will win. These things are best resolved not through litigation, but asking ourselves what is in the best interests of justice and the Indigenous peoples. And I have to say that in Paul Martin, we had one of the real champions for Indigenous justice. And so cases that might otherwise gone through the courts needlessly were resolved without having to go through the courts.
I might just add, as I think of my answer, just to be clear, the one part of the question that I think is actually not correct is the assertion that since this is the decision by the court, Canadian government has done nothing to respond to deal with the issues that were before it. That actually is not true. The issues that are now there are as to whether what the Canadian government has done is enough, whether the steps that they've taken are enough to satisfy the original decision. The government believes that it is a fair implementation, and they're continuing to implement the decision. And those who are taking the case forward say, well, they've done something, but that something is not good enough. But to say that they've done nothing or that they've just rejected the decision of the tribunal would not be correct. They've actually accepted the decision of the tribunal. Now it all comes down to, well, what does it take to implement it?
Make it happen. Thank you. I want to go back to something that you said, Bob, when you spoke about the disinformation, the cycle of crime, the cybersecurity. Could you speak more to that and what we as ordinary citizens should be aware in this new world that we're living in?
Wow, this is huge. I mean, I don't fully understand it all myself. But I think the best way of putting it is in countries that have complete control of the internet, like China, like Russia, a number of authoritarian governments, there is a vast use now of the same algorithms to control information and a huge amount of surveillance. But one of the things we need to understand is that this thing here is an instrument of surveillance, not just by governments, but by the people who are providing all the services that they're providing to us on the internet. And I don't think many parents are aware or people are aware, because the technology is so new, you know, how much information is being collected about each and every one of us as a result of our use of our cell phones. Our cell phones are data collectors for Google and Microsoft and Facebook, and so we're living in what we are also living in a surveillance society, and I think this has huge implications for privacy, for how information is shared, how it works. I think the thing we're becoming more aware of now is the extent to which there are campaigns of disinformation on Twitter, on every social platform, and a great deal of what we look at, which is frequently there because somebody's figured out that, oh, you like to look at this. Well, if you like to look at this, you'll like this too, and then you'll like this, and maybe you'll buy this. And so we've all got examples in our life where suddenly we went on Google and said, you know, show me a bookcase, and because I want to get a cheap bookcase to put over here in this corner, and then all of a sudden you're flooded with ads for bookcases, and then you're flooded with ads about books, and then if you wanted a bookcase, well, maybe you want a table, and you realize as soon as you go down this road, you're no longer, you know, you kind of laugh it off, but it's got very, very real and quite sinister implications. And I don't think our education system, the way I don't think we know how to use these things. And I think we've just waltzed into this technological universe without having any real clue as to how it can be used, how it can be hacked, how your privacy can be taken away, how you're sharing information with people you don't know you're sharing. And then there are other ways in which governments are, and active governments here in New York and elsewhere, are using whatever space they can to find out information about you. And if you're like me, a diplomat, you become very aware of the fact that whatever I say, you know, these machines are a bit of a microphone as well as anything else, and you need to understand the implications of the technology that we're living with.
Yeah,
Thank
and
you.
Anita, just to point out that Freedom House pointed out recently in a report, not only is it technology used for surveillance and disinformation, but for transnational repression. And we've seen that the China Human Rights Coalition in Canada put out a report about the transnational repression with regard to Canadians who are Uyghurs, Falun Gong, and the like.
Thank you. I'm not sure how much time we have left, but I have one question. Irwin, you spoke about the various pandemics that we are currently living with. I'm not sure whether either of you are aware that Winnipeg has been a center of resettlement and resources for a large Yazidi community. Operation Ezra has been responsible for the settlement and support of many. And when I look at your list of pandemics, it strikes me that the plight of the Yazidi hit almost all of them. As individuals, what can we be doing as governments? What can we be lobbying our governments to do to further assist with, in our case, the Yazidis, but with others as well?
Well, you know, you said when I spoke, Anita, that you know that it was a tough and sort of gloomy story. In fact, there's a huge number of great stories. I mean, on immigration, you know, Canadians can be enormously proud of the fact that our community sponsorship programs are being widely adopted in many, many other countries, that we've broken down a lot of resistance to to refugee welcoming and understanding that, you know, openness is a major feature of Canadian society. These are really important expressions of solidarity on the part of Canadians that I think are entirely commendable and actually something that this government actively supports. We've sent a very clear signal that we're going to be home to a lot more Yazidis, that they're going to be refugees who will be recognized and come to Canada. There are many living in Turkey at the moment and other places in refugee camps in various parts of the Middle East. And you know, Mr. Mendicino has said, no, we will consider, you know, we will deal with them in a positive way. And I think that's a very positive thing we can do. Plus, on accountability, Canada has been hugely supportive of the tribunals, of the UNITAD set up in Iraq, and of other tribunals where we're really trying to bring people to account for what has been done. What happened to the Yazidis was an unbelievable assault on their dignity, their lives, their very existence. And it's been a hugely painful decade for the Yazidi people. But hopefully, I think we can see signs that we are going to be, you know, doing what we can as a country to make sure that people are welcome and to make sure that their genocide is recognized. I think those are things we can do.
Thank you. Irwin?
You know, just to follow right up on the last point with regard to genocide, I think that what makes the Holocaust and the genocides that followed, and this year we commemorated, as it turned out, not only the Holocaust, but the genocide of the Tutsis in Rwanda on the same day. And we've had the Never Again convention, the Genocide Convention has been yet again and again. I think the emerging lesson for me of all of these and the study of the genocide is that what makes these genocides so unspeakable are not only the horrors of the genocides themselves. That would be bad enough. What makes them so unspeakable is that they were preventable. Nobody could say we did not know. It is true with regard to the Holocaust, certainly true with regard to Rwanda, Darfur, and right now in terms of what is happening with the Uyghurs. Nobody can say we do not know. We know, and we must act. And I think the important lesson in all this is, as Elie Wiesel would remind us again and again, the danger of silence in the face of evil. That silence always means coming down on the side of the aggressor and never on the side of the victim.
Thank you. I'm going to wind this up, but I'd like to ask each of you whether you have any closing comments you'd like to make, and then we will say thank you. Bob?
Just to say thanks to everybody. Thanks to you, Anita. Great to be with Irwin, and wonderful to be with my Western friends and my Winnipeg friends. It's great to be with you. Really appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.
Irwin?
Bob said it as best and better than I could have said it. The only thing to just add what he said earlier is that I do hope that the time will be soon when we can get together in person and not just virtually, so we won't have this kind of distancing, but we can engage each other and even hug each other.
Well, that'd be wonderful.
As we say next year in Winnipeg.
And we say amen. I would like to, again, on behalf of the Jewish Heritage Center and all those associated with it and the community of Winnipeg, thank you both very much for your time, your willingness to share, and I wish you well. And Irwin, please stay safe where you are. And thank you both very much.
Thank you. Nice to be with you. Great to be with you.
Same here. Let everybody be safe and healthy wherever they are.
Thank you.
That's true, but you particularly at the moment. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thanks.
Bye.